My name is Ian. I'm 20 years old and I like video games. Like, a lot. I especially like making games, and I'll admit that's mostly in the form of prototypes and systems demos, but I did work on a game called Trolley Problem Inc. See, there I am in the credits. And who's that playing the game? Oh my goodness, it's famous content creator Slimecicle, or perchance significantly more divisive content creator XQC. That's pretty much been the highlight of my career so far, but I'm looking to change that. This is Station 77. It's my fixed camera, Silent Hill and Resident Evil 2 inspired survival horror game that I'm making. It didn't always look like this though. In fact, it used to look like this. At 9:30 PM on Monday the 12th of November, I started developing Station 77, though I didn't realise it at the time. What I was actually trying to do was create a really short game that could be played through in half an hour or so to fill out my portfolio. Then everything spiralled out of my control and I'm still here 5 months later. This video is about that spiralling process, the ups and downs of development, as well as a couple of other things that happened along the way. Let's get started, shall we? For a while, I've had this idea lurking in the back of my mind for a fixed camera horror puzzle game that's a bit like the escape room sequences in Resident Evil 7 and 8. Happy Birthday and House Beneviento respectively, is what they're called. The escape room genre is one that I think is well suited to horror, and I'd always liked the idea of having a crack at one myself. I actually did try prototyping one a little while ago, based on the Doctor Who episode Midnight, where the Doctor ends up trapped on a little shuttle bus thing on an alien planet and something's trying to get into the bus. It's a really good episode of the show, definitely recommend watching that. It's a good piece of context for how things ended up where they are now. So, back to 9:30 in the evening on Monday the 12th of November 2024. While I didn't set out with an immediate deadline, I did have a set of goals I needed to reach and a vague plan for how to go about that. How? How is it broken already? I had a to-do list. I had a to-do list. I recorded a lot of this early stuff as my intent was to finish the project and then do an evaluative write-up devlog about the experience. In a weird way, I have sort of ended up doing that, I just have to keep going after this. Anyhow, it only took about 4 hours for me to set up the movement and the original version of the inventory screen. This was before I'd really figured out an aesthetic direction for the project, so it's designed to look like the inventory screen from the original Resident Evil 2. Much like everything else you see here, this is going to change. By the end of the first week, I'd got a strong core and good momentum. I was starting to think about perhaps expanding the scope of the project, going from 3 areas at 20 minutes completion time each to a wider scope, maybe a game that's closer to 3, 4, 5 hours long. I'd also started figuring out how I could create assets which looked halfway decent, so maybe I could put it on Steam. Here's some footage of me driving around and mulling on this idea.
Yes, my problem might not be with the idea of releasing the game, but rather the fact that the idea of it being on Steam and asking money for it, which I would do, kind of legitimizes it as a video game and suddenly means that my work can and will be judged alongside the work of people I look up to and respect. Maybe this is in fact about my own insecurities. Maybe this is about not wanting my work to be judged and criticised and perceived.
By the end of this first week, there is even already some stuff in the game that I can't show you because it's carried on into the final version of things, and therefore it's a spoiler to show it to you, which is slightly frustrating because it appears in a significant proportion of my early footage. During this first week, I was experimenting with different artistic techniques that I could use and realised that the iPhone 15 Pro that I'd recently bought to replace my aging iPhone 7 had a really good camera, and that I could use photos of things to create textures that both looked good and I knew I'd have the rights to use. This discovery came when creating this floor texture, which can still be seen in the current version of the project and is my actual kitchen floor. These books from my bookshelf are another example. I also discovered the site Photopea, which can be used to create normal maps if you either don't have Photoshop or for some reason your Photoshop refuses to do normal maps like mine does. I did, however, make some slight errors during this early period, namely making absolutely all of these textures, even the ones for small and inconsequential things, 1024 by 1024. This is quite a large texture size for some of these uses, and later on in development I'm having to demaster a lot of them into lower resolution versions of themselves. This is helping to create that early 2000s PS2 kind of aesthetic I wanted to go for anyway, so it's not a problem, just time consuming. Things were starting to look really good for this project. I had ideas, I'd overcome the challenge of asset creation, historically one of the greatest hurdles I've faced in prior projects. I was starting to feel like I might really have a game worth playing on my hands, and this was all in just 2 weeks, remember. Then my girlfriend of 3 years broke up with me. I was absolutely blindsided. Just for clarity, there's no big drama, just times and feelings change, but I don't do well with change at the best of times, so this completely derailed me for a little while. But after getting good and drunk, facing off against some personal demons, and recognising that I was going to have to face this with a degree of emotional maturity sooner or later, and opting for later, I started thinking about the project again. The reason I mention this is that there's a bit of a lull in my recording and general progress after this, so we're about to have a bit of a time jump and not a great deal of meaningful progress made, and that's just what was going on in that gap. I felt that in the state I was following the breakup, I needed to focus on something big, something I could really pour myself into, so after a few days off, I started designing and mapping level layouts for this larger game that I'd been thinking about, and trying to write up a proper design doc. That document went through quite a few iterations, but eventually we got to this. 10 pages of documentation on the design and narrative of what was now named Station 77. Over December, I shifted from recording all of my progress every day to infrequent updates where I just showed off the stuff I'd been working on after finishing it. On the 12th of December 2024, I recorded the final update video until early February 2025. At that point, the project looked like this. I was still greyboxing things, but I had an idea of the kind of structure I wanted the game to take. I'd decided that you'd start out in the medical bay. I had a tone that I wanted to aim for, deciding on 70s genre sci-fi in the vein of the Alien films or John Carpenter's The Thing. I'd really started to conceptually solidify, though I had very few practical examples of, the art style I wanted to aim for, and a lot of high-level story ideas were starting to take shape. I kept working right up until Christmas, and I was right back on it in early January, not that you'd know it from my footage. Now seems like a good opportunity to take a short interlude and talk about this finished design document, to completely outline the game I'm making and essentially pitch it. So, Station 77 is a single-player, light survival horror game blending a pastiche of the pulp style of 70s and 80s sci-fi movies like Alien and The Thing, cigarette smoke fills the air, big chunky terminals with great clattering keyboards on every desk, that sort of thing, with the exploration and puzzle solving of classic horror games like Silent Hill 2 and the original Resident Evil 2. One of my main intentions with this project is to settle a gripe I have with the modern remakes of old fixed camera horror games like this by demonstrating that a fixed camera style can be used creatively and with stylistic intention rather than just being a product of limitation or an outdated design concept. In this particular department, it draws a lot from the strong visual style of directors like Wes Anderson, Mike Flanagan, Edgar Wright, and Robert Eggers. The story setup is that you are a member of a crew on a deep space research and exploration mission for the Earth Research and Development Institute. In 2016, the ERDI commissioned 100 research vessels to be sent into deep space. You are aboard the 77th unit of that 100. The journey is simple. The crew spends 5 years in stasis as the ship reaches the outer rim of explored space, then travels for 5 years on a flight path to a target point, with some deviation allowed for points of interest picked up by the long-range scanners. Then the ship will perform a wide turn slingshot and align with a return vector, and spend 5 years travelling back over a different portion of space, continuing research and exploration until reaching the outer rim again, whereupon the crew goes back into stasis or hypersleep for the final quarter of the journey in the return to Earth. However, during Station 77's return flight, the player character ends up in a medical pod after some routine maintenance goes severely awry. When you awaken, the ship is in ruin, the engines are silent, and it's up to you to untangle the mystery of what happened and try to get home. The core gameplay is based around exploration and puzzles, finding certain keycards to gain access to different wings of the ship, and repairing damage to the ship as you find it. All the while, though, you are being stalked from the vents by a monster. This monster acts as an independent nemesis entity like the Xenomorph in Alien Isolation or Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. Your goal is never to kill the monster, just to evade it. The game is intended to be about 4 to 5 hours in length and relays most of its story through computer logs found during exploration. It is not intended to be a hugely challenging experience, but rather an atmospheric and tense game, bringing more narrative satisfaction than mechanical. The version of the game that you saw from early December was still in a very early prototyping stage, with grey boxes being used to get a feel for scale and layout. Over December, though, I focused on creating custom level geometry and figuring out how to solve some of the early problems. For instance, in this footage from December, you can see a wall which is black with white dots on it and text that reads "The Final Frontier" or something like that. This had me stumped for ages, because I decided early on that I wanted a moment right after you step out of the medical bay where you walk past a large window looking out to space, but I just could not figure out how to get a good, convincing space skybox. The answer was to use a higher resolution image. It's situations like this that I'm very grateful for modern hardware. Being able to strategically use a very large, very high resolution texture, whilst everything else is a much lower resolution, is a great way of creating a strong sense of scale. For good measure, I included a star and a planet outside, and on the advice of a friend created a shader to put on the planet which gives it the effect of the light from the star bleeding around the horizon. I think it's really quite effective. This brings us, finally, to when I next checked in with OBS in early February. Now, I know some things look quite different, but the overall layout is actually unchanged. By this time, I'd made some improvements to the camera system, allowing for transitions between world cameras and interaction cameras like the ones used on terminals and door keypads. Cameras could now also track both in translation and rotation. The most immediately obvious change is the degree of asset work that I've done, creating colour-banded walls to give the player a visual indication of which section of the ship they're in. I've already mentioned the window to space, with which I'm still thoroughly chuffed, though in this particular version there's actually an additional window cube still nested in there, which is causing that weird edge refraction issue. I solved that not long after this. So, time skipping once again to when I'm writing this script in early April, and the changes are significantly more incremental again. A lot of the work I've been doing in the last 2 months is art stuff and background production things. I've been ferreting away at the Steam page, which somehow still isn't ready to go live, but aside from that, I've continued to fill out the assets in the first room of the medical bay, as well as the medical team's office. I have started grey boxing and setting up lighting and atmosphere settings for the next couple of areas, and I've created the skeleton of a saving and loading system. I've also made a proper character model and giving him some animations from Mixamo. This is where I'm going to have to segue into a slightly difficult discussion just briefly before we continue with talking about development. If this game sounds like the kind of thing you'd be into, then please consider sending me a couple of bucks via my Ko-fi link. Work is hard to come by at the moment, so I've kind of been putting my all into this project, and if you guys are interested in playing it, as well as seeing the development process, the support would mean more than I can express. If there's significant support, I'll start up a Patreon, run a Kickstarter, or something like that. I know money is a slightly difficult discussion topic, so I'll be brief, but just for a look at the numbers, my goal is to try and put together somewhere between £1,000 and £5,000. It's just me working on this, so my outgoings are very low, and this would achieve 3 things. Firstly, a portion of that money would go towards a Steam Deck. I genuinely believe this game is well suited to playing on the Steam Deck, and I'm keen to get it Steam Deck verified, but I don't currently have one to test on, which is a bit of a limiting factor. Second, it gives me a fund I can pull from in order to pay contractors if I have them on board to work on things like art assets or music or whatever. While I am mostly working on things myself, I would really like to have the option of this. Finally, it pays me a salary to keep working on this full-time for another year or so, while keeping my portfolio website up and my car fueled. I'm in the fortunate position of still living at home with my parents, and while this can be frustrating for personal independence, it means that my outgoings are minimal and I can live for a long time on not very much money at all. £1,000 to £5,000 for a year is quite a small salary, but I'm still an unproven developer, and I don't want to ask for tens of thousands of pounds when nobody knows if I can even deliver on my promises. I know I can, but you people don't, and that's a big issue if you're giving me money to make a game and these devlog videos. So, if you'd be interested in playing this game, following the development of it, and maybe seeing your name in the credits, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll put together a proper plan for funding development. Thank you very much for listening, and now back to our regularly scheduled programme.
And I get frightened, just like you.
You now know what state the game is currently in, like right now on my computer, so let's talk about what needs to happen next. The short answer is quite a lot. The longer answer is that, and I should stress that this is all just next steps, not everything that needs to happen before the game is finished. I've started setting up the Steam input system for proper controller support, but it's still in its infancy. There's still basically no audio in the game, aside from some minor keyboard clatters and Steam hissing effects, which I was using to test things out, so I need to start getting more background sound effects in, such as footsteps. I need to get a lift set up that can move you between floors, as well as expanding out camera zones to the next few areas. Around then is also when I want to implement a proper system for loading and unloading game objects, as right now they all just get loaded in at once. That's not too much of an issue at the moment, because of the limited complexity of everything I'm working with, but by the time the entire station is laid out, I imagine it'll start feeling a tad sluggish. Unreal's basic frustum culling has been doing a pretty good job of handling it so far, but I think pairing that with a more purpose-built system would be a sensible thing to do. A single class that somehow maintains all of the game objects and geometry in all the levels and can issue instructions to become invisible or stop ticking, things of that nature, would be really useful. Then using a system of strategic airlock type doors and lifts to unload previous areas and load future ones. I think this is the best way to optimize this while still keeping things both consistent and seamless. Though that is currently just a theory, and we'll have to wait and see how it shakes out when I've actually tried implementing it. While the core puzzle mechanics of door locks and keycodes are set up, I need to redesign the terminals to be more designer-friendly. Basically, right now, its functionality is hard-coded, and what I want is to create an infrastructure thing so that I can just create a data table of the emails and things that it needs to display, and attach to the object in Editor. The inventory screen needs to be redesigned. I also need to actually set up the ability to hide in lockers and cupboards and such in the style of Alien Isolation, as that's a key mechanic for the game which doesn't currently exist. Likewise, the repair system, where you have to fix bits of the ship as you go, which is essentially just a slightly different version of a locked door puzzle, I still haven't fully figured out. The character model could do with a bit more detail, especially on the clothes, as these are currently just a bit too basic, even for my basic art style. I'd also like to create a couple of slightly different player models with different hair and lab coats so that I can have dead bodies. I know that sounds weird, but, you know, you find the crew throughout the ship, so I need to basically model the rest of the crew. I can also use this to create some pre-accident screenshots, which will be nice and fun. That's slightly lower priority, as is remodeling the player character or improving the player character, but needs to be done. Finally, there's one other thing, which I mentioned in the design doc section, which is the monster. Now, I'm still not 100% certain what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to start out, I'm going to model it, I'm going to get it ready for some screenshots and basic animations so that I can, you know, prep it on the Steam store. But I think there's going to be a lot of work that goes into creating that AI system, and, well, it'll be an interesting devlog, let's put it that way. To answer the big question in the room, when can I play it? I'm honestly not too sure. As we've just been over, I've got rather a laundry list of things to get done before a demo is ready. Sure, a lot of this stuff isn't necessary for a demo, but quite a lot of it also is. Something else that I haven't mentioned for a publicly facing demo is that I'm going to need to set up a publicly facing Steam page, and as I mentioned earlier, that's a bigger process than I'd anticipated. However, I'm continuing on at a decent pace. Obviously, I've had to take a few development days off to make this video, along with its companion video, which should be going up around the same time. But after that's done, I'll get on with the first couple of areas. The introductory first chapter of the game should cover the first couple of areas, kind of the first act, I guess. And then that'll be the demo that you can play for free, and that'll just stay there. I was incredibly keen to get the store page live for this video's release, so that I could, at this point, say, if this sounds interesting, you can wishlist it here, but unfortunately we're still a bit off from that happening. In the next devlog, I'm going to cover the process of implementing proper controller support through Steamworks, and modelling, texturing, and rigging the monster. During that process, I can then finish up the last bits I need to get done on the Steam page, and get that live, and hopefully devlog 2, or 1, depending on how I'm numbering these, can go up with an actual honest-to-goodness coming soon Steam page, which would be quite exciting, I think. Anyhow, in the meantime, that's all I've got for you, I'm afraid. If you'd be interested in donating to a Patreon or something of that sort, please do leave a comment and let me know. As you're on your way out, please like and subscribe, and go watch one of my other videos that I've made. One should be suggested to you on screen about now. Thank you again for watching. I have been your host, Ian, and good night.